Um, so for somebody like St. Thomas Aquinas, these arguments, philosophical arguments for God, are kind of icing on the cake. In other words, in his Summa Theologica, which is a book that's that thick, right, about 2 or 3 inches thick in translation, these 5 ways, of which we're only going to consider the 5th, take up just a couple of pages, right? But it is an interesting question both for theology and philosophy, whether there might be evidence from what is seen that points towards something that is unseen, namely whether God exists. And so of the 5 ways, only the last one is the design argument. The first 3 are versions of the cosmological argument, which we just, for time limitations, aren't going to do. And I never do the 4th. But at any rate, we have, why cannot things in nature direct themselves toward an end or goal? Well, Aquinas is writing at a time in the Middle Ages when the works of Aristotle are being rediscovered by those nasty crusaders that the Obama administration, in their Marxist leanings, like to denigrate. But at any rate, oddly enough, the early Christian church didn't care so much for Aristotle because he was much too focused on this world, whereas Plato was very otherworldly, right? You're talking about the forms existing in another world, then Augustine can come along and talk about the forms being in the mind of God. So I guess some of them were burned, and for about 1,000 years the works of Aristotle were kind of lost to the Western world. But they were preserved, oddly enough, in the Arab world, and they were rediscovered by the Crusaders. And so here's Aquinas in the Middle Ages having to make sense of what seems to be new truth coming from things like the works of Aristotle and reconciling that with his Christian faith. And so the first 3 arguments, the first 3 ways, are really rehashings in a Christian context of Aristotle's proofs for a prime mover, a creator of everything. The 5th way is a version of the design argument, but it's based on Aristotle's view of the world as imbued with purposes, a world where things have purposes. Another name for the design argument that I put on the blackboard when we went over this is the teleological argument, from the word telos, which is an end or goal or purpose. So the fact that nature is viewed as having things that serve purposes. And we remember when we went over Aristotle's Ethics, and we may have time to review that for him, things in nature have purposes, and he asks if human beings have a purpose. And of course, Aristotle basically says that human beings' chief purpose is to be reasoning beings, to investigate things by using our theoretical reasoning, but also to use moral reasoning. So we get in Aquinas' version of the design argument And this view, this ancient view that nature is imbued with purposes, also seemed to mesh well with the Judeo-Christian view that God has built things with God's own purposes in mind, right? So you have Aquinas saying, why cannot things in nature direct themselves toward a goal? Well, his answer is that they lack intelligence. There's no reasoning in them. They reject the view of materialists that matter can think. And so they lack intelligence. So if they can't direct themselves toward a goal, the conclusion that Aquinas draws is that they must be directed toward a goal or a purpose by an external force, an external intelligence. That external intelligence for Aquinas being God himself, who creates things in nature to fulfill the purposes that they serve. And he gives, and you saw in the PowerPoint, an illustration of an archer. To direct a non-intelligent arrow to its target, you need behind it the intelligence of an archer. Now, I think Paley did a much better job at, and he reflects some arguments of Cleanthes, of bringing in purposes when he talks about the difference between a rock that he might find while on a walk in a field, in a heath, and something like a watch. And he says, well, if I came across a rock, I might think it's been there forever. It was created entirely by natural forces, and I don't think anything of it. But he says if I would find a watch in the field, the answer that I gave for the stone, that, hey, it might have been there forever, it was just created naturally by forces working in nature, doesn't work for the watch. So Paley says, why doesn't it work for the watch? Well, here again, he focuses on telos, on purposes. He says, the watch, unlike the stone, has various moving parts that enable it to fulfill a function or goal or purpose. Now, this is an analogy. So what is it analogous to? Well, we saw that Paley thought that even if we had no example of something in nature that has various parts that work together to fulfill a purpose, even if we had no other example than the human eye, Paley would say that would be enough for us to conclude that it needed an external intelligence or designer. Just like the watch needed a designer to make those parts work together to fulfill the purpose of moving the hands so that we could use it to tell time. And I'm told elementary school students today, some of them don't even know how to tell time on a clock, because nobody teaches them how to use an old tick-tock clock. They can read a digital clock, but, the hands, which is too bad, because they haven't gone from the world. But the point is, just as the watch needed a designer and maker Paley would say, so things in nature that fulfill a purpose like the eye needed a designer and a maker. See, now, Paley was wrong that, matter can't think. Here we have thinking matter. And that computer say, you know what, I can really mess him up if I just go to sleep right now. And so the computer goes out. Anyway, now David Hume, among the three things he wanted to be remembered for in his life, was a refutation of the design argument that he had, especially in his dialogues concerning natural religion. As I mentioned, this was a book written by Hume at the end of his life that was so controversial that he instructed his publisher not even to publish it until after he was dead. And he knew he was dying of the same ailment his mother had, which we think was stomach cancer. We don't know for sure. So Hume basically says he has Cleanthes, the character in his dialogue who wants to give God human qualities. Cleanthes, a name from hoanthropos, the Greek word for man in the generic sense, and thes for theos, from which we get the word theism, God. And so Cleanthes is the intellectual believer. He would be very much like the deists of Hume's day and Thomas Jefferson's day, who they want a rational faith. They don't want to depend on things like the occurrence of miracles to rest their faith on. So Hume has Cleanthes give the design argument, right? This is not because Hume is trying to convince us of the design argument, but he wants to get it out there for his discussion. So basically, Cleanthes says that the world is like a giant machine. People in those days were even talking about the clockwork universe, that the rigid laws that govern the motions of the planets in their orbits were so strict that it's like the whole universe worked like one big giant clock. And so he says that things in this universe, that while the universe is like one big giant machine, many, many things in this universe are like smaller machines. And here he talks about things like the eye and the ear. And Paley echoes that, writing after Hume. In other words, the eye is like a small machine that accomplishes a particular purpose. So are things like the heart. And, we could list things ad infinitum here. So describe the basics of the analogy. Well, the whole universe and things in the universe are like a giant machine. And basically, they have parts in them. Means, as he says, are adjusted to ends. In other words, the way that these parts are structured, they tend toward the goal of fulfilling a particular purpose. And of course, the argument is that they didn't just get that way from the way things occur in nature, but that they were designed and made to fulfill their purpose and function. So this is the design argument, and logically we call this an argument from analogy. That is, you say that two things are alike in some ways, and that's your premise, and you conclude from that that, well, they might be alike in ways that we can't see directly. In other words, if the watch is like the eye in having parts that work together to fulfill a function or purpose, then maybe as a conclusion, the watch is like the eye in also needing an intelligent designer to design them to fulfill that purpose. Now, of course, Hume is going to try to argue that this is a weak analogy. And, you know, we'll leave you to guess how well he criticizes it. So Philo is a character who is the skeptical philosopher in the dialogue. And his view of analogy is that not all arguments from analogy are bad. I lit a match this morning. I was pretty doggone confident that when I moved it across the striker, it was going to light. Why? Because I've seen many of the same instances happen, and so I'm comparing apples with apples. This match is probably going to light because that's what happens when we draw a match across the striker. Yeah, go ahead.
About that because it doesn't always happen. It doesn't always happen the first time.
Well, that's right. And that that brings up an important point about arguments from analogy. They're always probable arguments. In backgammon, I don't make my moves, and other experienced players don't make their moves based on knowing exactly what our opponent is going to roll on the next roll, but we make our moves probabilistically. We try to make the move that gives us the best chance for developing our game while at the same time lessening our downside risk. And so you're right. You can't always predict that things will do the same, right? My car for 100,000 miles ran fine when I pushed that accelerator down. You know, the last time it didn't run so fine when probably the timing belt broke and screwed up everything inside. You know, so Hume basically says there are good and bad arguments from analogy. And you can go back and look at his comparisons. He tries to teach people that the more alike the cases you're comparing, the better is your argument. The stronger evidence is the analogy for its conclusion. But when you get, you know, like blood flow between human beings is a very strong analogy, that it flows in me and in my body just the way it does in yours. But when you get farther and farther away, you're likely to be led to even a wrong conclusion. And he says you couldn't conclude because there are some superficial analogies between sap in vegetables and blood, and they both flow through tubules. It would be wrong to conclude that sap flows in plants the way it does, you know, that it circulates the way blood in humans. So what is Hume trying to say? He's also trying to tell us not only that the design argument may not be a strong analogy, but that it may lead us to a wrong conclusion, namely that there's a real designer of the universe. Remember, Hume's a skeptic. Okay, so that's what makes an analogy weak or strong, how alike the cases are. We have an ordinary expression that focuses on this. We say that person is comparing apples with oranges. They're comparing things that aren't alike.
Yeah, it's based on what a person really has a taste for.
Okay, so whoa. So to get to Hume's bottom line, he tries to say that, first of all, we don't have multiple cases that we've observed of universes being designed and created, right? The only thing we know is the universe we have, the world we have. And so it isn't like striking a match or seeing that stones roll downhill or that something falls when it's dropped. We don't have multiple cases to base our argument on. But also, Hume tries to say that if we're comparing manufactured things, like a house or a ship, to the universe, he says, it's not even a close analogy. Now, here again, Cleanthes does bring up the fact that there seem to be many examples of design in nature like the eye. But Hume just kind of glosses over this, doesn't really give the case very well, where, in other words, you can say, well, is the eye closer to a manufactured item than is, say, the universe itself? And if that's the case, does that make a better analogy? Well, I'm just going to throw that out there. So Philo's view of this analogy then is that it's not comparing very similar things, manufactured items, to the universe, and it's not a good one. Order and design, what Hume tries to also say is that there may be many causes of order in nature, and direct design and manufacture of something is only one possible cause, that there could be material causes in things in nature that are responsible for order. And the example I gave you, which is not Hume's, but I think illustrates it very well, is like the forming of crystals, quartz crystals or sugar crystals. They look like they've been designed and created. They're so exact in their structure, and yet it's the laws of nature that are responsible for them. Now, of course, from the Judeo-Christian view, God is the author of nature, so it only pushes the question back one level to say, well, there are mechanical forces that create crystals. Well, you can say, well, who set up the world so that things work that way? We're finally coming, I saw some water freezing yesterday. We're back to freezing temperatures. You ever think what happens? I mean, with most solids, they are heavier than their liquid form. But it is not the case with ice. Think about it. If ice were heavier than water, ice would form on the top of a pond and it would go crashing down to the bottom and take everything in the pond with it. Why doesn't that happen? Because the unique crystalline, and you've probably been told this in physics, the unique crystalline structure of ice makes the solid form lighter than the liquid. Well, you say, isn't that a happy accident of nature? You know, but a believer would say, well, you know, maybe it's not an accident. Maybe somebody who set up the laws of nature realized that things need to be that way. Well, at any rate, but Hume says there are alternative causes of order and that design, direct design, is only one of them. So he says, even if you do find order, you can't conclude that the only possible cause of order is direct design. Now, you also have Hume trying to say that unlike somebody like Aquinas and Paley, for them there's only one real answer to who's the designer of nature. Hume's basically saying the argument can have many equally viable conclusions from the same premises. And what Aquinas and Paley would have us conclude, namely that the designer and maker of the universe is the God of the Bible and church tradition, in the Judeo-Christian tradition that they're working in, Hume would say, well, no, there's other possible causes of order. There might be something internal to matter. You know, and we didn't go into Darwin specifically, but basically that's one of the things that Darwin tries to explain, how an entirely random process can cause order by things like adaptation and natural selection. Well, let me move on here. Does Philo believe the design argument can reliably show us that human qualities apply to the deity? And the answer is no. He says there are any number of conclusions. Does he seem to agree with Cleanthes that you can base your whole theology on the design argument? No, not really, because if you're trying to make the design argument stand on all four legs, the problem is that that there are other possible conclusions, and it's hard to do. So anyway, those are some of the main things on the design argument. What I want to do is that we very recently went over Descartes. Oh, that's right. We didn't. Right, Aristotle's Ethics we did last test. I'm trying to shuffle between what I covered at Ethics and what I've covered for you all. Well, so the Meditations. Again, Descartes needs to examine his beliefs because he thinks he's had a number of false beliefs. And he thinks a lot of false beliefs have crept into philosophy, especially from medieval philosophy. And so, again, what he is trying to do is not end up a skeptic, but just the opposite. He wants to show that we can set knowledge in philosophy and science on the same kind of absolutely certain foundation that you have in like a system of plane geometry, where the axioms are absolutely true and self-evidently true, and everything that's derived from them can be taken to be true as well. So he thinks that's what needs to be done for philosophy, to find some absolutely certain principles to rest philosophy and science on. So he's going to use this method of doubt. Methodic doubt is my preferred term for it, to treat his current beliefs as if they were false if he can raise some doubt about them. And so he takes whole categories of beliefs, not individual beliefs, and raises doubts about whole categories of beliefs. The first group of beliefs are beliefs that he has resting on what his senses tell him. And so why the dream conjecture shows ordinary beliefs to be doubtful? Well, if we can have the same kind of vivid experience in a dream as we do in everyday life, and yet we wake up and we find that those beliefs were false, then he says we can raise the question, well, how do I know for sure that I'm not dreaming now? And if I can't show for sure that I'm not dreaming now, maybe the beliefs that I have that are based on my senses, even though they seem very obvious and certain, like that I'm in a real room, seated in a real desk, that I have a real body, that I'm writing with a real pen. He says, even though they seem obvious and certain, maybe we're wrong. And for Descartes, the mind could be creating all these things as it does in a dream. I showed you the Matrix because the presumption of the Matrix movies is that a computer program thought up by the evil machines that have taken over the world is causing these beliefs, building a whole world for people. So Descartes uses the dream conjecture to question what his senses tell him. And why is waking not distinguishable from sleeping? Again, he doesn't think there are any sure tests. He mentions some and rejects them all as not being sure tests to distinguish waking from sleeping. So the point is, if he's calling into question what his senses tell him, this also applies to not only ordinary beliefs, but to beliefs in the sciences that are based on observation. So now, the sciences that are not built entirely on observation are things like the science of mathematics. And so it's important that he can't question things in mathematics by saying he might be dreaming, because he says even in a dream the principles of mathematics, like that a square has 4 equal sides, are going to still be true. So he raises the hypothetical doubt that an evil entity, an evil genius, or an evil demon might be deceiving him about mathematical proofs. And I said, to make Descartes a little more believable here, ask yourself if you've ever screwed up when you were doing a math problem, or gotten less than 100 on a math test, So what if some evil entity were making you screw up? This is kind of the doubt that Descartes raises. So the one belief that survives is the belief that he exists. if he's doubting everything around him, even the truths of mathematics, the one thing he can't doubt is that he's here to do the doubting. If he's being deceived by an evil genius about all of his beliefs, the one thing he can't be deceived about is that he is here to be deceived. So he says, the one truth I have is that I exist. And again, he so the essential properties of an immaterial solar mind is thought. You know, Descartes essentially says doubting, being deceived in my beliefs, these are all mental acts. And so I'm essentially an immaterial soul in a material body for Descartes. What the 20th century philosopher Gilbert Ryle called the ghost in the machine. So, you know, so the why knowledge of mind more certain than knowledge of body? But namely, he says, whatever I affirm about a material thing also affirms me as the perceiver of that thing. Well, we just did Locke, you know. Again, Descartes tries to get us out of skepticism by relying on his innate knowledge. For Locke and the other empiricists, there is no innate knowledge. The mind is a tabula rasa at birth, a blank slate, and it's experience after we're born that writes on the tablet. For Locke, an idea is what our mind immediately perceives. Locke is where Descartes put him, in the egocentric predicament. His view is that the understanding, the mind, is immediately acquainted directly, only with its own ideas, only with its own inner mental life. And the trick is to get from knowledge of my own ideas, from my subjective knowledge of the world, to the claim that I know something beyond that. Locke rejects the existence of innate ideas, so he can't use Descartes' way out, which depends on relying not only on the cogito, but other innate ideas like his innate idea of God. The ideas for Locke come from sensation, from what our senses tell us, and reflection on what goes on in our own minds. Basically, most of the ideas we have are complex, but they're composed of simple ideas that are the ideas of the qualities of a thing. So our idea of a telephone is a complex idea composed of the simple ideas that make up its qualities, like its size, its shape, its color, its weight. Primary and secondary qualities. Secondary qualities are subjective and in us for Locke. They're not really in the world. They include things that are perceived by only one sense, like colors, sounds, tastes, smells. Primary qualities are things that can be perceived by several senses, like hardness, the shape of something, its motion in space, its number. These, Locke says, are really in things in the world. In other words, I could feel by touch that this is a rectangular table, but my sight will also tell me. So its shape is something that is a primary quality. For Locke, we live in a real material world where things exist apart from our perceiving them. These desks were here when we weren't here, but they only have the primary properties. Things like colors, smells, tastes, sounds, they're subjective and in us, but they're caused in us by the primary properties of real things in a real material world. For Locke, we don't know the world directly, but only by means of our internal images or experiences, only by means of our ideas, but they represent the world to us. Just like probably none of us have seen the president directly, but we think we could recognize him if he walked past us on the sidewalk. Why? Because we've seen many representative images. And so Locke's view is that we don't know the real world directly. His view is called indirect realism. He thinks we're in a real material world, but we know it only indirectly through representative images. We're going to see in Locke and Berkeley that this leads to skepticism. Okay, I'm